but I want to move on to something that Governor Walsh has called you and Donald Trump, and that is weird.
Sure.
And it is taken off. The New York Times reports that when Donald Trump was asked about it, he said, "Not me, they're talking about JD."
Well, certainly they've levied that charge against me more than anybody else, but I think that it drives home how they're trying to distract from their own policy failures. I mean, look, this is fundamentally schoolyard bully stuff. They can accuse me of whatever they want to accuse me of. As Harry S. Truman once said, if you can't take the heat, stay out of the kitchen. And I'm doing this because I think that me being vice president will help improve people's lives. So I accept their attacks, but I think that it is a little bit of projection, Dana. If you think about just take a couple of days ago. Tim Walz gives this big speech. He's been announced as the VP nominee. And I remember when I had just been announced as the VP nominee, I gave my big speech and I saw my wife and I gave her a big hug and a kiss because I love my wife and I think that's what a normal person does.
Yeah. I mean, there is nothing more normal than describing kissing your wife and be like, I then kissed her because that's what a normal person would do.
Yeah, I actually beat some weird allegations. I think it was like maybe a few months back. I said I hug and kiss my friends and my girlfriend and give them kisses on the cheeks because it's normal, And then they said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were weird, but now you clarified, right?"
I stand corrected.
Yeah.
Most normal person of all time.
Yeah.
So we did cut off at that sentence just because it was the funniest place to end it. But let's watch just a teensy bit more.
So I think that what it is two people, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, who aren't comfortable in their own skin because they aren't comfortable with their policy positions for the American people. And so they're name calling instead of actually telling the American people how they're going to make their lives better. I think that's weird, Dana, but look, they can call me whatever they want to.
You're saying Tim Walz doesn't have affection for his wife? I don't even understand that.
I said that he acted weird, which he did, on a national stage in front of his wife and in front of millions of Americans who presumably were watching at home. And I think that it's projection, Dana. Look, I think this election should be about who's going to solve the inflation crisis, who's going to make groceries and housing more affordable, who's going to secure that southern border. Kamala Harris's record is that she supported all of the policies that made that problem worse, Dana. We're trying to say we're going to take the country in a different direction.
Yeah, the thing that really strikes me about that is, so I think we did lose a sentence there in the middle where he said that that Waltz shook his wife's hand and that was weird. But the thing that I'm struggling with here is that the reason he shook his wife's hand is because they're not comfortable in their own skin, because they're not comfortable with the policies they have for the American people. So, when you're really comfortable about your policies, you go for the kiss. But like when you're uncomfortable about when you're racked with guilt about your bad policy positions and how they're going to be bad for the American people, then you do the handshake.
That's why Bernie and his wife just had crazy sexual chemistry, because he was so comfortable with his, and we all remember that.
Yeah. It was actually uncomfortable, but yeah.
And for us, they were extremely comfortable with each other and their policy positions. You see why I'm comfortable with my wife touching her like this and that? Because I'm comfortable with my vision for America. Yeah. It all felt like I don't know about you guys, but like some consultants in a room just like cooked up that transition from how do we they had like on a whiteboard, like how do we get from that actually they're weird to they have bad policies. It felt like he was reading through notes.
It felt like he took some very attentive notes, but then when he was trying to actually implement it in the middle of the interview on the fly, it got a little bit messed up in transmission.
I also like, to call us bullying, that's school, or to call us weird, that's schoolyard bullying, and that's beneath us. But also, they're weird. Have you thought about that?
Yeah. I mean, it's also. On the subject of schoolyard bullying, it is kind of amazing how at the beginning of that clip, he just does a "thank you, sir, may I have another" for Donald Trump throwing him under the bus. It's like, oh, he said, oh, they're not talking about me with the weird. They're talking about JD. Is like, oh yeah, well, the president, yes, he was correct about that. But
yeah, because Trump's not weird at all.
yeah, well, sure, but you know, it's also just like the ultimate Trump thing, you know, to be like, you can't laugh it off, you know, you can't even do what JD Vance did, right? And like just try to do some sort of, well, actually, I'd prefer to talk about policy. Thank you very much. It's actually gets under your skin. You have to be like, oh, I don't think they're talking about me. It's not about me.
It's I mean, I guess you could like literally spend basically an entire season of any show talking about Republican hypocrisy. I mean, Democratic hypocrisy is one thing, but like with Republicans, obviously the idea that they with Trump at the ticket stick to policy. They never go into culture war or random name calling, or you know, for that it's all about business, baby. I mean, come on.
Well, it does strike me that in that clip, he doesn't say like, oh, why are they talking about this instead of talking about policy? I want to do things to help the American people. Like, and then you could end that sentence by mentioning some policy. Instead, it's like, look, I want to talk about policy. Anyway, did you see Tim Walz shaking his wife's hand?
Wait, what policy is that?
Yeah. My policy is actually to fix the economy. So they're not, you know, they're not. Why are we talking about how?
The only time you touch your wife's hand is when you put a ring on it. Like after that, you know, never happens again. Like that's the policy. It's a very important, you know, wife hand policy. Yeah, no, it's amazing. But I do, you know, I suppose I have participated in Is JD Weird Discourse. So last week I wrote an article for Jacobin that was called JD Vance Got His Faux Populism from Internet Weirdos. And it, you know, it basically, I found myself in this very, very weird position of realizing, and this doesn't say anything good about how normal I am, that I know a weird number of people who know the Republican candidate for vice president. So Amy Therese, who I started out talking about there, you know, my predecessor, you know, at the Dead Pundit Society. She was already on her speed run to the right when I started co-hosting that show after she left. Is, you know, probably somebody who's tweeted about me hundreds of times, has interviewed JD Vance. We listened to just a tiny bit of that interview before, but I think we're going to listen to more of it in the post game tonight. And, you know, Politico came out with its list of the 6 thinkers who have influenced JD Vance's worldview the most. And there are 2 of them who I've done debates with in the past. So, you know, that's odd. This is not a point of pride. I feel a little embarrassed that I know who some of these people are.
Yeah. Furniture salesman. You still have a lot of friends from those days that you keep in touch with. They seem to know JD Vance.
Yeah. HG says Ben part of the elites confirmed. I think unfortunately Ben, no offense, but you know, JD is he's like an elite weirdo. I think that this is Ben part of the weirdos confirmed more than Ben part of the elite confirmed.
That's correct. Yes.
You have proximity to many a great weirdo who then have proximity to people who unfortunately are part of the elite strata of our society, which I wouldn't have it any other way. But
no,
yeah,
but that's exactly right. Right. I mean, look, I'm a you know, I am a left guy who enjoys doing debates with whatever strange marginal people on the right, you know, will have me. And so I have come in contact with these people. And it turns out a lot of them are friends with JD Vance. So there you go. Draw what conclusions you will. But exactly, it's turning into a struggle session.
You need help. You need help, Ben.
This should be a moment where I reevaluate my own life choices that, I've come into contact with this many people have come into contact with JD. But we will talk about that more in the post game for patrons tonight. But I do want to switch gears to talk for just a few minutes about the other article that I wrote for Jacobin this week. The week before I hadn't done anything, so doubled up this week, which was about Cori Bush. It's called AIPAC bought Cori Bush's seat, and my basic take on this is that there are, and I really mean this, right? This is not a token acknowledgement. Like I think this is true. There are, I do not doubt in the slightest, all kinds of nuanced and less obvious things you could say about what went on with this election, about mistakes that Cori Bush made, about vulnerabilities, about how things were handled, blah blah blah. All true, right? Could have written that article, or better yet, I'm sure other people who are better positioned to, right, could read that article. And it's not that I don't have any criticisms of these people. That none of that's the point, right? The point is all of that could be true, and the bottom line truth here is that if the America-Israel Public Affairs Committee, better known as AIPAC, hadn't shoveled a truly ungodly amount of money into this race, Cori Bush would have been renominated, no problem, right? Was sailing in that direction, before all this happened. In fact, her challenger, Wesley Bell, was originally something like 17 points behind, and just again got a tremendous amount of ad money poured into the race. And in fact, this is, so I don't know if you guys are following Drop Site. So that's Ryan Grimm and Jeremy Scahill when they the Intercept has kind of been imploding. So this is the new site they started, but they it's available there. It might be available other places, right? But that's where I got it, right? There is this leaked call that Bush's challenger had called her like a year ago to say, well, let's play the call.
Yeah, don't need oxygen. Matter of fact, let them know, yeah, if you can tell them I reached out to you, I want to talk to you, I reached out to you beforehand.
Yeah, right, exactly.
I'm telling you right now, just there's some stuff that I know because I just from being in this game long enough. Those are their Holloman is a hack. He is a hack. And the proof of it is name one legitimate reporter that won anything even close to that. Like, this is stupid.
Exactly. No, you're right.
Don't even think for even a second that that's the case. And I'm telling you right now, I'm telling you on my word, I ain't not running any shit.
Well,
that is not happening.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate.
Yeah. So the context there is a local reporter had speculated at this point Wesley Bell, the challenger, was not running against Cori Bush. He was in fact running against Josh Hawley for Senate, which if he'd been able to dislodge Hawley, that would have been good, right? I mean, I think Bell's a pretty thoroughly mediocre Democrat, but certainly would have been better than Josh Hawley. And then from all indications, so at that point, there was a local reporter who had speculated in their newspaper column that, maybe the plan is that they're going to pretend to run against Howley, raise, he's going to raise his statewide media profile, and then he's going to turn around and challenge Cori Bush for this congressional seat. And so that was Wesley Bell calling Cori Bush and saying, no, this guy's a hack. He doesn't know what I'm talking about. I'm absolutely not running against you. And maybe that was true when he said it. It's possible.
I do have to say though, if I'm that reporter listening to this call, because she's like, yeah, he is a hack. Maybe she could call him up and say that was actually a decent call. Yeah, that was a decent call. As you were saying.
Yeah. But then October 7th happens. Whatever criticism you have of Cori Bush, this is true. She is one of the first people and the most decisive people to call for a ceasefire and to introduce a resolution into the House calling for a ceasefire, gave a really eloquent and good speech on why there needed to be a ceasefire, introducing this resolution on October 27th. So very, very early on. And at that point, AIPAC basically let it be known that anybody who went for this seat, against Bush would have essentially an unlimited amount of money behind them, which seems to be what tempted Bell into the race, if he wasn't already planning on it. And then, it's $8 million, which is an awful lot for a House race. And of course, at this point, Bell's getting lots of money from people who had been Josh Hawley donors, so the person who was allegedly running against the year before. And it seems, to me, right? So there was an article in Compact by Alexander Nazarian saying, oh, well, you can't really buy an election. Maybe you can influence it a little bit. And, my point about that is just, if you can buy some influence and that influence is decisive, I'm pretty sure that's what people typically mean when they use the phrase buy an election. And that does seem to be very much what happened here. And of course, you can find, I don't think we ended up grabbing any of these tweets. It's okay. But you can find, various people saying, anybody who's, anybody who's saying that, AIPAC bought this congressional seat is, they're doing tropes, they're promoting anti-Semitism, except of course, the people who like AIPAC who are like, yeah, good job guys. You got rid of that horrible comment. But the comment I made about this at the end of the Jacobin article, I said the usual pro-genocide ghouls will claim that telling the truth about AIPAC buying the seat is anti-Semitism because it promotes a narrative about Jewish money. That's nonsense, and not just because Jewish peace groups worked hard to re-elect Bush or because plenty of pro-Israeli donors are Christians. The deeper issue is that parsing the accurate observation about AIPAC as a claim about Jews, thereby equating AIPAC with the entire Jewish people as if entire ethnicities were hive minds that held collective political opinions and collectively acted in the political process, is itself deeply anti-Semitic, which I would definitely stand by. But I have to say, and I should say but, and I have to say, right, that I keep seeing people who are making it harder than I would like to make that argument as cleanly as I would like to make it. All right. So I'm going to give you a few different examples of what I'm talking about. And before I bring on Dan, we switch gears and I bring on Daniel and Matt. So, so I guess let's start with the Iran thing. Jake, you want to set this up?
Yeah. So, some of you might have seen this ad that went viral on Twitter X, which is it's purported to be from like Iranian television. I haven't independently verified that this is where it's actually from, but the point is that it went super viral. So it's a propaganda ad, anti-Israel about about Israel's participation in the Olympics. Do we want to set anything else up, or should we just check it out and then?
Yeah, I would just say there's a nearby version of this ad that would be a lot easier to defend, but they made a really unfortunate visual choice here that should be pretty obvious pretty quickly.
The visual choice, the anti-Semitic visual choice is that he has a bald spot, right? And
that's exactly what I'm getting at. It's like what the fuck? That's not true. Having a menorah tattooed to his back, I think is doing some pretty direct Israel equals Jews stuff, which is, the two groups of people who really like to do this are Zionists and anti-Semites. Right?
Yeah, most of us don't actually have a menorah tattooed right on them. I personally do, but it's actually very, very rare.
I mean, I got a Gentile question over here because
what is it? What's the question?
But my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that if you have a tattoo, you can't be buried in a Jewish cemetery?
I forget if that's. I know it's definitely supposed to be true. I forget how true it is the plot of a Curb Your Enthusiasm.
To say you can't do that because I understand he's the Pope of the Jews.
It's the plot of a Curb Your Enthusiasm episode.
Okay, well there you go. That's might as well be in the might as well be in the Gemara if it's it's a curb. That's right up there. I think, I think that this is, again, you're going to make the point that, Israel has blood in its hands for Gaza, etc. Very good stuff. I think you're really undermining that point when you do this thing that codes it as a claim about Jews. This is a guy praising this powerful ad. Seems like we went out of our way not to name and shame randos, right? This is somebody with a 50,000 follower Twitter account. I think we had a couple of others of these Dominic Lee, another one like that. I think there's one other, but in any case, that's like a sort of low end of the spectrum example of what I'm talking about. I think a extreme end that even if you think I'm being ridiculous about the first one, I hope I'm going to lose my mind if I'm wrong about this, and the chat full people be like, what, right? But I hope this one is straightforward. Is that over the weekend, I don't know how this started originally, but I saw all of this stuff on Twitter, all of this discourse on the phrase Zog. That would be, somebody calling themselves a Marxist who's defending the use of the term Zog, right? That's Zionist occupied government, which is a term.
Or own government. Oh, this guy's.
Oh, he was suggesting maybe own would be better than.
I got you.
Zionist occupied government is the original thing. That's a term that was literally invented by neo-Nazis. I think back in the 80s. It was popularized by David Duke, who I hope everybody's clear. David Duke doesn't give a shit about the Palestinians, right? That's neo-Nazis are not motivated opposition to, apartheid and ethnic cleansing. They're generally fans of those things, right? Maybe they don't like it when the wrong groups do it, but like even there, I don't think they get too hot and bothered about it because they're also doing it to people they don't like. So yeah, this is a term that was literally invented by neo-Nazis, and I've been seeing all this Twitter discourse over the weekend with people who are like, "Oh, what, right?" That's another one. So somebody getting mad at Natalie Wynn for objecting to the use of the term Zog. So other than being frequently used by reactionaries, how is Zog an inaccurate or even a problematic phase? Guys, literally, the term was invented by, and I mean, reactionaries is really burying the lead, by neo-Nazis, right? They're the ones who invented it. And when they invented it, the thing they coined the term to describe has nothing to do with Palestine, right? They're using, the occupation of the West Bank and all that as an analogy for how like the Jewish conspiracy controls the US government, right? That's their point. This is a pretty typical response from the people who are like, what? Why can't we use this term? Cedar Salvos, I have no interest in amending my language to make irredeemable racist scumbags who haven't said a word about opposing genocide feel more comfortable, etc. Right? And I think that there is this horrible dynamic here. And the people who I think are most at fault for this, because they exercise the most influence on, I guess what we'll just non-materialistically call the discourse, right? But the people who are most responsible for this are the people who cheapen and demean the accusation of anti-Semitism by throwing around constantly as a cheap smear of people who are speaking out against the genocide in Gaza, right? They're the most responsible for it because through their nonstop crying wolf about this, they've desensitized a lot of people to the charge, right? You just hear it and you just register it as, oh, well, this is just what they always say, right? Before I say this, let's just get to the example that sort of inspired the whole segment, because I think this is, pretty jaw-dropping. I think it's maybe not as bad as literally using terminology borrowed from neo-Nazis, but also in some of these other cases, who knows where ideologically some of these people we're talking about sit exactly, right? And this is from a unfortunately pretty prominent lefty account. So it's the Revolutionary Blackout Network, which is a podcast that lots of people watch. Says Kamala Harris married her AIPAC babysitter. Meanwhile, the dumb progressives are shocked she doesn't support an arms embargo on Israel. So the person being referred to as her AIPAC babysitter there, and there are a couple more tweets where it continues the thought, is Doug Emhoff. Doug Emhoff is Kamala Harris's husband, and he has dumb, shitty political opinions because he's Kamala Harris's husband, and like, if he didn't, they wouldn't have enough in common to be married. Kamala Harris sucks. She's a corporate centrist Democrat. She always has been. I actually think it's weird how much amnesia there's been about that, since she became the Democratic nominee. So of course she has normal establishment political views, and of course her husband has normal establishment political views, and every single Democrat, Republican with normal establishment political views is an apologist for Israel, right? That's part of the package. That's a basic American establishment foreign policy view. So of course he has those views too, just like Kamala does. I'll bet she spent a lot more time talking and thinking about it because she's a politician and he's not. This guy was originally an entertainment lawyer, and he was other kind of lawyer. And he, when he started dating Kamala, she wasn't even in a position where she had anything to do with foreign policy. She was still, she was still doing her Cop Mala phase in California, and They were set up on a blind date. If you're saying that he's her AIPAC babysitter, the only way this thought makes sense is if the inspiring premise in your head is AIPAC equals Jews, Jews equals AIPAC, right? And I'm sorry, but this really is ludicrously anti-Semitic on its face, right? I mean, the only thing, why is he her AIPAC babysitter, not the vice versa, right? Or, like, are his views on this any worse than Kamala's or Biden's or anybody's, right? Like, the only way this makes sense, it's because he's Jewish. And it's not just sort of normatively objectionable because, I'll just be a hugely cringy lib here and say that I think racism is bad. But, just in principle, although I do. But I have to say, given that all day, every day, the actual AIPAC types went to smear everybody who is speaking out against apartheid and ethnic cleansing in Israel as an anti-Semite, shit like this is essentially working for them, right? I mean, to the extent that if you want to be an anti-Zionist in the United States, 2024, you're in a war with these people, right? By which these people, I mean, like, AIPAC, defenders of the Israeli government. You're in a war with these people for hearts and minds. People who say stuff like this are collaborators, right? You're a wrecker, right? And I wouldn't advocate actually doing to them what was classically done to wreckers, but metaphorically speaking, you are in effect working for the enemy. Stop it. Okay.
I do have to say, I know we're gonna transition right now. I do think that would be a really, really great old-fashioned rom-com. You know what I mean? Like she was the attorney general, and he was her AIPAC babysitter. Watch them fall in love. Yeah. I want to see it. I want to see it if anyone wants to make it. But yeah, that's probably not what happened, but it would be fun.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, if AIPAC is, actually, I would support AIPAC randomly hiring people to date local politicians.
I like that he is also the honeypot. I mean, he did look pretty handsome in his younger days. I don't want to hate on anybody, but just this mild mannered.
It's like, we did a we have born identity this guy from birth for this one purpose. To seduce this person that we can sense will someday be the Democratic candidate for president.
Yeah, exactly.
I was just thinking that maybe they had like a dating app, like AIPACer or something like that. With, just an R at the end.
Yeah, exactly.
Nice. And she just swiped left or right or whatever it is.
All right. Well, enough of that. I want to think about Marxism now. That sounds like much more fun to me than we've been talking about. In the post, just as a preview for the post game, we do have. So we have a question from friend of the show, Matt Walsh. Do we end up grabbing that?
Oh no! But that was his question was he stated that if you go on, speaking of dating, if you go on a date with a man, ladies, because you want to take dating advice from Matt Walsh, that ask him what his favorite era of history is, and if he doesn't have an answer, that means he's shallow. So the question is, what does your favorite era of history say about you? We're going to talk about that and more on the post game.
All right. Looking forward to that.
It was there. Okay, sorry, I didn't realize. Andy, I cast this version. Andy.
If you're a woman on a date with a man, this test may not work as well in the other direction. You want to get a sense of how intelligent he is. Just ask this: what historical periods are you interested in? A smart, interesting man will answer the question easily and eagerly, excited that you asked, but he can't answer it or says something vague or name some historical subject, then can't find it. Explain why he finds it fascinating, and that's a very good sign that you're on a date with a shallow, incurious, dumb, boring guy who doesn't read. So there you go. this. Thank you, Matt. We will pre-vet everybody on screen for you with their answers in the post game. And right now, let's bring on Daniel Tutt and Matthew motherfucking McManus. How you guys doing?
Good, man. Good to see you again.
What's going on, guys? Good evening.
So yeah, thought this would be fun because I think that you have both written Lukács articles specifically about this book, The Destruction of Reason. Jake, I think we have that as a graphic. So yeah, that's Daniel's The Question of Worldview and Class Struggle in Philosophy, or the Relevance of Lukács' Worldview, Marxism, and the Destruction of Reason. And then we have Matt's and Jacobin, Georg Lukács, Diagnose the Irrationalism at the Heart of Right-Wing Thought. And I think this is actually the first thing that I was ever when I first started talking with Daniel. I think that's actually the first thing we were talking about was this book. And then when I saw that Jacobin had tweeted back out Matt's article, I hadn't been aware that he'd written it. I thought, oh, this would be a fun GTA episode. This is a discussion I'd like to have, and specifically I'd like to have with the two of you. So
I do just want to say, if you take a look at that Jacobin article, what I love about it is if you were to ask like Google AI to create like an image of a Marxist intellectual, it would 100% be the picture of Georg Lukács that you see there, right? Just fucking absolutely to a T, everything about him, from the mustache, the big hair, the glasses. It's like, oh yeah, definitely a Marxist intellectual, 100%.
Well, the funny thing is that was probably taken before he became technically a Marxist.
Oh yeah, before the First World War.
I mean, yeah. Well, who's keeping score? But I mean, well, I mean, that's actually part of maybe an interesting way into the meaning of the book. Yeah,
please.
Because, well, Lukács says that he is making a self-criticism of the European intelligentsia, including the poets, the philosophers, the so-called apolitical intelligentsia, the bourgeois intellectuals, including like everyone from Rilke to Zimmel to Max Weber. He was very close to Max Weber. He was trained by neo-Kantians in Lukács' youth. He was a Nietzschean. He was known as a great literary critic. He never got a full professorship, but he was sort of really, really well known for his book Soul and Form. So he made his mark as kind of like a great writer. And basically, yeah, that's the funny thing, is that 1917 happens, right? Bolshevism happens, and Lukács says that he has a conversion. And of course, he's known as the godfather of Western Marxism. And Western Marxism, for those of you that maybe know or don't know, certainly puts a big comparative focus between Marxism as a kind of political theology. This is obviously big in Heidegger as well. So there is therefore an interesting sort of series of stages of Lukács' own fidelity to radical politics that I find quite compelling. Not to mention the fact that he's thrown into the middle of wars and revolutions in Hungary. He is in exile in Uzbekistan. He's in jail for 2 years. He's living in the USSR. He thought that he was going to be taken to a gulag at one point. That didn't happen. And then he sort of ends his career as a sort of cultural attaché of the Hungarian government. And so he's such a fascinating figure because he's extremely productive throughout extremely productive, right? And the funny thing about this book, by the way, is a lot of people kind of have it wrong. And Matt, you probably know this too. Like, he wrote this book in the 30s. He wrote this book as in Germany, witnessing firsthand the rise of the Nazi regime. He didn't write it really as a retrospect. Partially he did, but largely it comes from a firsthand touch with the milieu leading up to the rise of Nazis, right? And immediately during that time. And one of the interesting things about that time is we have this text that he wrote against the Frankfurt School called the Grand Hotel Abyss, which is subsequently the name of a well-known book about the origins of Frankfurt School. Now, I consider it slightly a conspiracy, Ben, that essay has never been translated into English, but you could sort of find it online if you're savvy enough in an unofficial translation. But what it basically suggests is one of the core concepts that Lukács is working with in Destruction of Reason is basically that the Frankfurt School, as well as the large majority of German Marxists at the time, right, were abandoning what he calls praxis, right? They were abandoning, they were too contemplative. They were too caught in the seminar. They therefore were not proactive anti-fascists enough or adequately enough, right? Is the basic idea of it. And so he writes another text during the same time called The New German Ideology, which is basically the same play on the failure of Marxist intellectuals to combat fascism, right? And so what Lukács will basically develop is a whole new way of theorizing fascism, away from this kind of classical Marxist distinction between idealism and materialism towards rationalism and irrationalism. So he centers a theory of irrationalism, which of course we can define, and he performs a historical genealogy of its origins. So the book has been kind of misrepresented quite a lot. We can talk about that as well. It's kind of the stereotypes that exist about the book. They all emanate largely from Adorno. Adorno wrote a scathing review of the book, obviously saying this is the destruction of Lukács' reason. Anyways, I'm really giving you guys a lot.
Yeah.
Matt, feel free to jump in, but yeah, this is some things to know about the book. There's a lot. I mean, it was just recently re-released by Verso with a new introduction to it by Enzo Traverso, who's a great Marxist scholar. And then, we have the other thing to say about this is the place, Ben, where we find what you might consider to be the first systematic Marxist criticism of Nietzsche.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because Nietzsche in Lukács' eyes is the godfather of a particular form of irrationalism, which, importantly, Lukács theorizes. It's one of the interesting things about the whole book. Lukács theorizes the production of aesthetics and philosophy and of intellectual production in relationship to a kind of Leninist periodization. In specifically, he really thinks that when imperialism takes off after 1871 up through World War I, intensifying, right? And this is exactly when Nietzsche publishes his first book right after the Paris Commune, right? So Nietzsche is the sort of godfather of irrationalism in the imperialist period. What this actually imperialism indicates a whole series of movements away from the egalitarian foothold or foundation in 1789, basically in the French Revolution, in the Jacobin position, right? So he really sees irrationalism as a movement away from equality, as a movement away from universalism. This is also where racial theory and Gobineau in particular emerges from, in a kind of abandonment of the bourgeois liberal principles behind the French Revolution. And so imperialism only heightens this. It only heightens this and makes it even more obscure and more ungraspable. There's a whole other dynamic to Lukács' Destruction of Reason having to do with Marx and the position that Lukács places Marx and Marxism in Western philosophy, which I find really refreshing, because basically it's a point that he gets from Friedrich Engels, right? Which is that bourgeois philosophy in the academy after 1848 basically falls apart. due to Marx and Engels's revolutionary dialectic, in short, and that Hegelianism really after 1848 abandons all of its progressive components, or most of them. In other words, bourgeois intellectuals can no longer, with a straight face, maintain a philosophical worldview that would be in favor of a progressive social vision. Because for Lukács, the whole idea of Hegel is basically that society is finally graspable through the sort of instruments of philosophy proper, right? So he thinks that Hegel births a social dialectic, and that subsequent Hegelians totally abandon that, right? In favor of vitalism, in favor of sort of neo-Kantianism. And neo-Kantianism basically says that it's subjectivist, that history is not knowable, right? It's an abandonment of objective reality, right? It basically posits that experience is all that we can philosophize about, ultimately, right? And Lukács thinks this is fundamentally against Hegel. And that, yeah, so there's a lot there.
Yeah, no, that's good. So, so Matt, if you want to work this into when we get started, when as you start up, Daniel used this phrase, Western Marxism, talking about Lukács, and I think that a lot of people, might have some vague sense of what that means, right? But they see it either, thrown around as a pejorative in some cases, or they'll sort of have know a little bit, but if you wanted to kind of start us off on like what that means historically, like what's the difference between this kind of Marxism and like any other kind of Marxism?
Sure. I mean, it's a great question, right? And I want to point out, when you say, it's a vague concept, well, it's because it refers to a kind of vague thing, right? Like all broad traditions, there's a lot of debate about when Western Marxism began, who belongs in the canon, who's kind of an outsider to the canon, but was a fellow traveler. I've read just enormous amounts of things about Walter Benjamin, for example, right? Was he part of, Western Marxism? Was he an antecedent to Western Marxism? All that stuff's not really all that interesting, right? What is interesting is that, as Dan said, Lukács is taken to be one of the godfathers of Western Marxism, because on the one hand, he's very clearly committed to a pretty strident view of Marxism as a rational way of apprehending the world. And, that's pretty important if you're going to be a Marxist. But he also is rejecting the kind of mechanistic, deterministic versions of Marxism that you could sometimes see circulating in, say, the SPD, right? Or even in some factions of Bolshevism. And really what he became famous for in his first kind of well-known Marxist book, History of Class Consciousness, is the incorporation, and I know you'll love this, Ben, a certain kind of Hegelian ideas or Hegelian-inflected ideas back into the Marxist tradition, really foregrounding the importance of things like reification for Marx, which is something I'm very interested in, or alienation for Marx, right? A lot of people credit him with kind of reinvigorating this idea that, for the most part, people had dismissed as part of Marx's early humanist phase to the extent that they were aware of it at all. And he deserves a lot of credit for this. I mean, History of Class Consciousness is a classic for a reason. And I don't think that it would be fair to say that he inspired many of the others like Adorno and Marcuse, because I think they would have gotten to where they were going independently, right? But in developing the prototype for a Marxist thinker who was intelligent, undoctrinaire, but still committed to the fundamental rationality of the Marxist project, he was really a model for a lot of what was going to come forward within the Western Marxist tradition. And people like, again, Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse, many others are going to continue in the kind of spirit of this Lukácsian project, even though, as Daniel points out, oftentimes they were quite hostile to each other's interpretation of what Marxism was. But I just want to come back to this book for a second, because I'm a big fan of this book, except for the last couple of sections, which we can get into. I'm sure Dan's not surprised by that. So Lukács at the beginning of this book points out that it's an unusual project for a Marxist to undertake because, as he puts it, the goal of destruction of reason is to chart the road to Hitler in thought, right? And if you are a really orthodox or stringent Marxist, you might say, well, what's the point in that, right? Ultimately, we need to explain the emergence of Hitler by looking at tensions that emerged in the base of society, right? The real foundation upon which, the superstructure or ideological disputes play out. And occasionally Lukács will gesture in that direction by saying, look, I'm just talking about the most abstract determinant of Hitler's rise, right? There are other forces at play. But what a kind of show of intellectual prowess and a grasp on the reactionary tradition, right? I really want to see a lot more Marxists do what he tries to accomplish here, because what's really engaging about this book is how he really has a systematic understanding of the emergence of the reactionary tradition, its various permutations, its obsessions, its fixations. But unlike many of us, and I include myself in this, there's a kind of guiding Marxist thread that persists throughout his critique of all these different figures that brings a kind of unity to the text that other left critiques of the reactionary tradition don't always have. Now, as I'm going to point out, I think that sometimes this leads Lukács astray because sometimes he can apply too many Marxist categories or too many Marxist fixations to try to understand the particular orientation of a given reactionary thinker. And I think that a lot of his treatment of, say, people like Bertrand Russell or Ludwig Wittgenstein at the end of the book aren't very good in part for this reason, right? But what a tour de force. And it's really nice to see that the book has kind of enjoyed a resurgence in terms of his reputation in the 21st century.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, you'd kind of said at the, beginning of that, right? You sort of made you were describing some of the things that people are thinking about when they use the phrase Western Marxism to describe the kind of Marxism that, Lukács and co-thinkers are doing. And you mentioned a few things, sort of trying, to have a, less deterministic view about the theory of history, trying to incorporate more of this sort of humanistic concerns from the early stages of Marx's writings, at the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, where Marx is interested in these sort of this kind of dimension of anti-capitalism that seems very distant from what he's doing in like Capital, right? Where he's focusing on thinking about economic structures per se, but you talk about stuff like alienation. And then the third thing that you mentioned was about Hegelianism, and you kind of made this jokey comment about how that there was like sort of a reference to to me being less on board with this stuff. And that's true, of course, right? because I do I do think that that the kind of I do think it's a mistake to sort of go from like a kind of Hegelian language, talking about contradictions and things like that to
we do have a nice Hegelian triad here, though. I mean, we've got Ben, the analytical Marxist, Dan, like the resolute continental Marxist, and then we got me, who's maybe a kind of hazy but inconsistent, attempt to assimilate the two together. So that's
just the sensible center. You're just right. So
yeah.
So that's all true, right? I mean, there is a real disagreement there about how to think about methodology and all that, but part of my intention in getting this episode together is to build bridges, be a lover, not a fighter, and I think because I actually think that there's something here, and I think something certainly in some of the ways I've seen Daniel talk about this book in the past that makes me think that that some of what Lukács is talking about in this book and some of what you guys have gotten out of this book actually resonates in an interesting way with a lot of the sort of concerns that motivate that kind of analytical Marxist project that that I'd certainly identify with. That, in other words, it's like, look, universalism is good, sort of egalitarian, sort of kind of Enlightenment impulses are good, rationality is good, and in fact, right, I'm sure we'll spend, since the focus of the book is on reactionary thought, I'm sure that's where we're going to spend most of our time, but just to sort of draw out a point I was hoping would come out of this, and that I've certainly seen Daniel make when he talks about this, it's it's not good that the left has moved, like big parts of the intellectual left have moved away from this, right? That's bad, right? That sort of, I think actually the first conversation I had with Daniel was because I saw I had posted something about this and I was interested in it, sort of talking about the kind of post 1968, sort of left Nietzscheanism and how there's this sort of currents in certain, kinds of radical politics and certain kinds of continental philosophy that sort of come together in this rejection of all of the stuff that, that Lukács is, defending in this book. And I think that is at least some, there are at least some common concerns going on there.
Yeah.
No, big time. I mean, I think one way to get at this, of course, is for those familiar with Martin Heidegger, you can go to the section on Heidegger and discover that, in later Heideggerian reflections regarding the origins of fascism, what a lot of, especially folks in the French world after the war, started to theorize fascism as a perversion of humanism. Heidegger's letter on humanism, Lukács in a subsequent work will totally reject this and argue that fascism was fundamentally an anti-humanist rebellion, an assault on the ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity from 1789, as I mentioned before. And that there is therefore a through line that is laid down. And one of the interesting things about that through line is that it actually philosophically could be understood as a perversion starting in the field of what's called political epistemology, right? In other words, how do philosophers understand the knowability of society or the knowability of social antagonisms or the knowability of values, right? We know that for Kant, there is this notion that the thing in itself has a fundamental unknowability, uncognizable. There's a kind of kernel of an uncognizability. Well, subsequent Kantians, who Lukács was trained by, took that premonition of unknowability very, very far. And they did so in such a way that they destroyed, in Lukács' view, the whole premise of this kind of telos to history, right? That in Hegelian, or even in some readings, if you read Lucien Goldemann's book on Kant, for example, you'll notice that Kant's theory of the kingdom of ends, right? Kant's theory of community, Kant's theory of politics has an implicit socialistic impulse. The Neo-Kantians will reject all of that, and they will fall back on a certain kind of pessimism. And they will basically say that universal history is unknowable, right? Now, for Lukács, he thinks that this has profound effects on what the intellectual can effectively mediate or advocate in the social domain, right? So a big thing here, I mean, if you read like Friedrich Engels's notes when he was in his seminar with Schelling as a young man, I'm talking here in the 1830s, before 1848, you'll notice something very interesting, which is that philosophers at that time, obviously things are very different now, but just to give you a sense of it, were the expression of the direction society should take. And so it just so happens that Schelling is one of the origins of irrationalism, in part because the social forces that brought Schelling into his professorship were literally during and after the July Revolution, they were literally monarchists, right? So they were actually trying to bankroll a philosophy that would have an implicit solidarity with feudal absolutism, right? Against a fundamentally progressive Hegelian socialist vision. You can think here also of the pantheist controversy, right? So there is a certain sense in which Marxism, thrown into the milieu of philosophy at a time in which intellectuals had this power, became extremely dangerous, right? And that's why Marxists were drawn outside of the academy. Now, Schopenhauer emerges very importantly as a thinker who's basically for the first time, and then Nietzsche would innovate this further. But Schopenhauer introduces a new vocation of the philosopher, which is a philosopher now can be a freelance, no longer necessarily governed by the academy. And that actually Lukács shows, because a big focus of this book, by the way, is basically what's the social power of the intellectual in a certain way, right? Mm-hmm. How does the intellectual shape social vision at a kind of collective level, right? So that's a big focus of the move to irrationalism, is this kind of abandonment of collective responsibility for the fate of society, right? So I mean, we can get into this genealogy that he creates. I think it's important to not read the genealogy too literally. In other words, he's not, and I don't know if you agree with this, Matt, he's not sort of arguing, even with Nietzsche, that Nietzsche is responsible for Hitler or that Schelling is responsible for the Nazis or anything crazy like that.
No, that would actually be more of the Heideggerian position, right? That ultimately, you know, any political view, like instantiation of a metaphysical view, is ultimately determined by that metaphysical view, or best explained by that metaphysical view, right? That's exactly the kind of irrationalism that he wants to be very critical of.
Precisely. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, you know, look, part of what this has to do with is the social struggle about the unfulfilled achievements, right, of the French Revolution. And I think that at a certain point, what happens in European society in the story that Lukács tells, right, is that Germany has a whole section in the beginning, very interesting. It's a historical materialist sociological analysis of Germany, where he says Germany didn't experience a full bourgeois revolution. And it had a stunted social development, right? A regressive, stunted social development. He gets into the Junker class and Prussianism and the authoritarianism implicit in that. And so he begins from this materialist sociological foothold, and then also examines, and then he really examines this in his later work in the Budapest School on the ontology of social being, this kind of conundrum, which is, how can German idealism be the site of some of the most precocious and refined a Renaissance in philosophy, starting with Goethe all the way up through Nietzsche? How can it be that in a society which has this social regression, which doesn't experience the same progress as France, for example, give birth to this? And so he has some later speculations on that, but in this text, he puts a big focus on that. I think that's important to state. And again, the other point that he makes, and I think this is an interesting one, Ben, you probably would maybe disagree with it, is that he sees Hegel as what he continuously says as the philosopher who completes German idealism.
Yeah, so this is a way that people often talk, but I'd actually be very curious to get either of you guys' take on what exactly that means. Right? like what's like give me like a 2 or 3 sentence version of like, what does it mean to complete German idealism?
Well, this is in a more Lukácsian sense, right? I think it's important to grasp why he thinks the failure to complete the system of German idealism is going to have like extraordinary implications, right? So I think here it might actually help to take a step back and talk a little bit about Kant and reason, right? Which will try to get a sense for the scope.
I'm gonna want a definition of completed sooner or later, but you do your thing. I'm not going to stop you.
I'll do my best, right? So to like the earlier point that you're making, right? One of the things that I find refreshing about this book is that it very much does resituate the left in the history of Western rationalism, universalism, and humanism in a way that the kind of postmodern turn tended to obscure in a lot of ways. And here we can kind of go back to Kant, right? Now, Kant, of course, has mixed feelings about the French Revolution, but he's very insistent about the fact that there's a kind of fundamental equality to all human beings that arises as a result of our all being equally rational in a certain kind of way, right? And from this, right, Kant also anticipates certain developments in the philosophy of history in his piece, like the idea of a universal history with cosmopolitan intent, right? Where he talks about how human beings are gradually enlightening to themselves to the point where heteronomous social institutions and heteronomous ways of thinking about things will no longer be necessary. We can abandon them and people can essentially rule themselves. That's putting it really simply, but you know, it's Kant, so give me a break, right? And then you get Hegel, right? And Lukács is, idea is precisely that Hegel, to a certain extent, carries this to its logical conclusion by developing a theory that allows human beings to understand not the natural world or even epistemology, but their own history, right? Their own coming to the heights of rationality that they've now achieved through this long dialectical process. And Lukács is very explicit that this is an enormous achievement, right? Bar none. And the interesting thing about the book then is why, if to a certain extent, Hegel seems to have at least opened the door for human beings understanding their history, this was spun off in a variety of different ways. One of these ways, of course, was Marxism, which Lukács thinks of as not necessarily completing the system of German idealism, but turning it back on its head and putting it on a more rational basis by moving from the ethereal world of heaven to looking at the facts of the matter on the ground. And we talked about this a few weeks ago, Ben, when we talked about G.A. Cohen's theory of history, right? But the other strand of response to Hegelianism was this kind of rabid rejection of its historicism, its rationalism, and its optimism, right? And this is what you find in the writings of two of the authors that people are probably most familiar with, who figure large in Lukács's book, Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard, right? Now, people might find it odd to associate Schopenhauer or Kierkegaard with the reactionary tradition because they're not usually associated with politics. Although I learned from Lukács that apparently Schopenhauer was alive in 1848 and was goading German soldiers on to shoot at revolutionaries in Germany, right? Being like, oh, there they are, right? So about as reactionary as you get, right? But Lukács shows very convincingly that what Kierkegaard and Schopenhauer did politically, right, even if they were not necessarily self-conscious about this, was to say, look, this idea that you find in Hegel that we can understand human history, that it is moving towards ever greater rationality, equality, and freedom, all that's bogus, right? We need to recognize that the human condition is radically fallen, and consequently, any improvements that we see in the world are happenstance, extremely fragile, and very likely to be broken if we aspire to anything more. And what's really impressive, and Lukács is very clear that it is an impressive accomplishment about Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard, is how intellectually respectable, even deep, they were able to make these positions come across, right? So just very briefly, right, his reading of Schopenhauer is fundamentally as a philosopher of bourgeois insularity and interiority, along with Kierkegaard, right? But in a different way. Because Schopenhauer says, look, the world is just will. Will is blind. It's certainly not rational in any way, shape, or form. And ultimately, this idea that we could have a progressive idea of history is foolishness because the will strives blindly for its objects of desire. But even if it gets them, it's going to be unhappy. So the best thing to do is, well, to have never been born, you know, the wisdom of Silenus. But if you're unlucky enough to be born, then try to comport yourself with this kind of stoic attitude of resignation towards things. And Lukács is actually quite funny. I mean, his sense of humor is underestimated, where he points out that in the 20th century, you can see this in any number of different kind of bourgeois attitudes about withdrawing from the world, entering into these kind of Zen moments, drawing upon Eastern wisdom, right, to try to reconcile yourself for all the happenstances, anything to avoid being political, right? And he points out that Kierkegaard enacted a relatively similar kind of turn inward, right, where Kierkegaard's going to say the realm of the ethical is really not going to provide human life with the kind of existential thickness that is required for human beings to think that they lead a meaningful life. Only the realm of faith is sufficient in order to do this. And so what did Kierkegaard decide? He says, best thing to do is become apolitical, go to a monastery, and try to discover God. Realizing, of course, that there's no rational way to connect with God. It's a kind of leap that you're taking, right? And, you know, Lukács is going to point out that inspires any number of existential individualists to withdraw from political agitation, withdraw from progressing, from improving the world into their own kind of romantic ruminations about things. Now, does this necessarily have... Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, I think it's probably worth underlining that that I think, right, Lukács's point here is not just, oh, look at these people who are like concerned with stuff other than politics and, you know, trying to get other people to be concerned with stuff other than politics, right? Because I think if that's how you're hearing it, right, I mean, that might sound a little unconvincing, right? I mean, it's you know, if somebody's, you know, I don't know, if you're you know, James Joyce wrote Ulysses instead of writing Capital Volume 4, that doesn't make him a reactionary, right? You know, but but that the point is that a lot of this stuff is actually deeply incompatible with emancipatory politics, right? I mean, so like certainly in the Schopenhauer case, you know, what you're saying, you know, about the sort of impossibility of historical progress, right, is sort of given deep human irrationality, or, you know, even like, I mean, Kierkegaard, you know, I mean, it's like the sort of reject, like the, you know, most 101 level famous thing about, you know, Kierkegaard, you know, as the celebration of you know, Abrahamic faith that, you know, God tells you to kill your kid, just do it, right? You know, don't question it, right? Like is, you know, I mean, I think is really a celebration of letting go of this sorts of impulses that would lead people towards, you know, interest in emancipatory politics, and really even sort of finding fulfillment in this like really self-conscious irrationality.
Well, this is where I just want to make one comment, and then I'll pass it on to Dan, because I'm sure Dan is going to want to talk a great deal about this. What's interesting, and he points this out pretty consistently, is this philosophy of bourgeois interiority that finds expression, as he thinks it, in Kierkegaard and Schopenhauer, by itself might just lead you to a kind of conservative politics, a la Schopenhauer, right? The idea that, look, you shouldn't really try to change things all that much. The revolutionaries in 1848 are playing a loser's game and expecting that they're going to make things better. They're probably going to make things worse. So really the best thing for them and for everybody is for them to get shot, right? Nobody will get their hopes up that way. And, you know, Kierkegaard has this kind of anti-politics politics, right? He's extremely critical as of the present age, as, you know, was signified by the titles of one of his pamphlets, sees it as a crass, leveling epoch. So the best thing is to retreat from it. But what's really interesting in the pivot point of the book is how these kinds of attitudes eventually do become more militantly political in extremely dangerous ways. Remember, the book is about the road to Hitler in thought, and whatever else you say about Hitler, he was not a man who was willing to sit there brooding upon his own private sensations and saying, most important thing is to withdraw from the world and not try to impact it, right? He very clearly did want to impact it. So this is where, to invoke Daniel's point, the Nietzsche chapter is probably the most important one in the book, because it's really the pivot point between these insular, brooding, dark kind of outlooks and the moment where they become radicalized and do want to shape the external world, but in this extremely aristocratic and violent manner.
Yeah, so a couple of points on this notion of why does Hegel complete philosophy?
Yes,
It's not just German idealism. I think actually it's better understood as like philosophy as what Kant calls critical philosophy, right? So he gets it again mostly from Engels. Engels is probably one of the most important silent partners throughout the whole entirety of Destruction of Reason, because Engels himself actually wrote quite a lot about intellectual life. It's a book about genealogy of intellectual ideas, right? And one of the things that Engels says upon reflecting in his later years after Marx is dead about the famous theses on Feuerbach is that if Hegel ends philosophy, the dialectic becomes a social tool or instrument for the liberation of society. Now, at that moment, the inescapable fact of society was the schism between bourgeoisie and proletariat. Now, philosophers therefore have an ethical / political choice in the face of that inescapable fact, which is they can affirm it or they can obscure it, right? Right. And that obscuring of the elephant in the room, as it were, could kind of be thought of kind of akin to climate change today, right? You have to understand that capitalism, as Marx and Engels encountered it, right, even as Lukács encountered it, could viably and reasonably be revolutionized. And it was. You know, the Bavarian Socialist Revolution, the 1917, the social order had the possibility of revolutionizing itself, of transforming itself. After Marx and Engels overcome Feuerbach, the dialectic is now in the service of a revolutionary transformation of society. Hegel simply provides two things. One, a new vocation of where progressive social philosophy can go, which itself means that Hegelianism, which basically means that Hegelianism imminently represents the victory of the left Hegelian position. That's the final comment on Hegel. This is afforded by Lukács's study called The Young Hegel, where he shows, this is another reason why Hegel's a social philosopher, that basically the young Hegel provides a prototype of an account of the structural contradictions of the capitalist social order. Basically, that Hegel was close to what Marx did. It was only natural that someone would make this turn to a systematic analysis of both historical materialism as well as political economy, because it's already embedded in Hegel from the get-go. And moreover, both Kant and Hegel, as I mentioned before, have a political solidarity with the masses' egalitarian expression from the Jacobin flank of the French Revolution. When Hegel wrote the Phenomenology of Spirit, Lukács argues that the text was a polemical text against Schelling, precisely in the context of the bourgeoisie seeking to restore the ancien regime. In other words, the Phenomenology of Spirit in Lukács's eyes was an egalitarian attempt to preserve the left-wing values of the Jacobins. That's a pretty interesting reading of Phenomenology of Spirit. A lot of people don't read it that way.
If I could
And
just,
a lot of people, please,
Yeah.
go ahead.
yeah, no, I just wanted to add something about this, right? I think if you read the Phenomenology of Spirit closely, which I did this winter with Ben, actually he was there, he gave a lecture to it. What's really interesting about the book, and I know that Daniel's lectured about this, is precisely how much he insists that the resolution of traditional philosophical problems cannot be achieved until we think about them historically. Now, this might seem to lead to a certain kind of relativism, but it's going to be extremely important for Marx, because the argument of traditional philosophers from a Marxist perspective, or even a Hegelian perspective, is that, look, we just haven't found the great individual genius who's yet been able to kind of break through to see the world the way that it really is, right? Yes, we've had our Platos. Yes, we've had our Aristotles. Yes, we've even had our Kants, but we haven't quite gotten there yet, right? And what Hegel and what Marx do very, very intriguingly is to insist, look, it's not simply a cognitive barrier that's implicit within one person's mind. It's the historical ways of thinking that impose limitations on what people are able to apprehend at any given time. Seen thus this way, we can realize that once we enter into a higher stage of history, different kinds of illusions will strip themselves away, and then we can again understand the process that led us here, which ultimately for Hegel, I think, is the real truth that philosophy is supposed to expose, right? Our own coming to being of self-consciousness and freedom. And what Marx does very, very interesting, very, very engagingly, to your point, Ben, which is why you might say he completes the system of German idealism, is to further invert this and say the one mistake that Hegel makes is still assuming that this is an intellectual enterprise, right? That truth will only be understood once we've reached this historical epoch, because Hegel will understand how these illusions are being stripped away historically. What's necessary is to recognize that it is actually the proletariat that will change the relations of production by seizing the forces of production and then strip away the kind of ideological illusions that are brought about by capitalism, feudalism, slave society, et cetera, and then we'll be able to apprehend the world more directly, certainly our social world, than before, right? And thus, right, the end goal of, or the end point of philosophy is not a great intellect or a great individual who resolves all the philosophical problems, or at least many of the philosophical problems, but instead it's a social resolution that takes place by humanity as a whole, as it emancipates itself. And I have problems with this thesis, but you can really see why Lukács, since he does take this seriously, would see this regression into bourgeois individualism and this idea of the great genius as being extremely problematic and a kind of regression to a pre-Hegelian outlook.
Exactly. It's what he calls aristocratic epistemology.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Which is an interesting concept and category. It basically means swapping reason out with myth or intuition as the arbiter of truth. Okay. So if you think about that for Schelling throughout the entirety of his thought argues that what's missing in Hegel is a focus on intuition. Now, again, this is the subtlety of Lukács's reading method. He's saying that by implication, right, the social implication of Schelling's centrality of myth and intuition is going to result in a conception of praxis, okay, which he again thinks that is what occurs, and he's getting this from the theses on Feuerbach, on Marx and Engels, like what happens after Hegelianism. Well, the dialectic becomes practice. The dialectic becomes this social instrument, right? It's like an instrument for liberation of a class. And so intuition basically mires the philosopher in subjective idealism. That subjective idealism goes against Hegel, because one of the implications of Hegel's system is that the act of philosophizing connects one to the social being of their time, right? The comprehension of the absolute is the comprehension of one's own time in thought, right? And that comprehension only occurs through a procedure of a process, which involves many errors and so on, right? The whole owl of Minerva, right? That means that the philosopher is not an isolated monad, and they're definitely not in Kierkegaard. This is why Kierkegaard and Hegel are so far apart. Subjective idealism is to be rejected in this sense, right? But subjective idealism is a hallmark of irrationalism in a certain way. And one of the interesting things that ends up happening as irrationalism matures is the idea that myth, experience instead of reason, right? Intuition become the ground floor for the development of what Lukács calls a Weltanschauung. So what that means is that irrationalist philosophers such as Dilthey, who is a very important neo-Hegelian philosopher, will write a lot about the need for philosophy to invent a Weltanschauung. The problem is with this worldview that he invents is that it's founded on the premise of an irrationalism, right? And that moreover, what that actually ends up doing, and this is why, why Lukács has an implicit Marxist approach here, is basically the claim that irrationalist philosophies that try to create a worldview end up only supporting bourgeois individualism, right? Because he thinks that there's something implicit in Hegelian Marxist philosophy in the dialectic that allows for a collective development of a worldview. That's the task that philosophy must set itself. The mission that philosophy must set in the wake of Hegel is to sort of construct that class worldview. Now, a lot of postmodern philosophy has chastised Lukács for insisting on this point. We can break that down on the merits or the lack of merit in the notion of thinking about class vis-a-vis a worldview. This is very similar, by the way, to the core idea that a lot of people in modern academia talk about of what's called the standpoint theory, standpoint epistemology. Lukács is the godfather of standpoint epistemology, right? In Destruction of Reason, it's worldview, which is you could think of almost as a more ambitious category than standpoint, right? Because it's a class worldview. How can class liberation be thought at the philosophical level? According to Engels, is basically that's what Marxism sought to do. And because it was rejected by the bourgeois academy, the period of the Second International was basically a highly philosophical period in Marxist time. I've talked to many philosophers on my podcast about this, that, there's a certain way to read Marxism, right? As a kind of active philosophical project that basically the bourgeois academy kind of fell back into irrationalism, but a lot of Marxism kept the Hegelian rational project going in a certain way, right? That interests me a lot. That interests me as sort of for today in thinking about the application of some of these ideas of how philosophy might, because if in the thesis on Feuerbach, what we're left with is this notion that philosophy is basically not worth anything unless it is in the service of changing the world. Lukács' point would be irrationalist philosophy just cannot conceive of changing the world, and nor does it care to.
Well,
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Ben. Yeah.
Well, I mean, so there's this interesting question about what Marx means when he says that right at the end of the thesis on Feuerbach, right? That philosophers have only sought to interpret the world, but the point is to change it, because I think a sort of reasonable, simple-minded objection to that would be, well, hold on, right? Like, yeah, I mean, if you're sort of taking that last part as just kind of rah changing the world, right? Then like, it's like, yeah, I mean, why the philosophers, right? It's why not any other group, right? Hasn't changed the world. Why not the, historians or the, plumbers, right? Isn't the working class supposed to be changing the world? What does all this have to do with philosophers? And,
Right.
there are a few different ways of sort of understanding what's going on there. But I think one that I think something Matt said earlier kind of hinted at, right, is that, but a way of reading that I've always found pretty compelling is that, Marx thinks that there are illusions, right? That there are gaps between the way things are and the way things appear to be that, have deeper roots than, like just making mistakes in how you're thinking about it, right? That they arise from social structures. And that you can't actually get rid of them if you haven't gotten rid of the underlying social structure, right? So that it's like a mirage that, like, even if you become intellectually convinced that it's not there, you don't stop seeing it, right? And you have to actually change the conditions that give rise to it. I mean, this is like early Marx's sort of critique of the obsessive atheists of his time, right? He's an atheist too, but he says, look, there's the, people are going to want to keep taking the opiate, of the people, because the conditions that give rise to that, right, need to change, right? Just going around kind of telling people they're wrong isn't going to do it, right? So I think so one way of reading that passage is,
I thought it endeared you to people more than anything else.
No, it's generally right. That's what you should do. You should just go around telling people they're wrong all day, every day, but right. Win friends and influence people. But the people, that one way of reading what's going on in that passage is just to say, look, if the sort of fundamental thing that we're trying to do when we do philosophy is to understand the world as it is, to sort of pierce through, illusions, then there comes a point where you sort of can't do that just by doing philosophy, right? You have to do that by, doing social revolution.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Matt. Yep.
Well, this is where I want to get to the pivot point in the book, because I agree with everything that Daniel said up to a point, which is the point where this kind of nihilistic insularity that's characteristic of aristocratic epistemology can genuinely become active and very threatening, because again, road to Hitler in thought, right? So I think what's really engaging about this book, to Daniel's point and to what you're getting at, Ben, is he holds out this prospect of, look, we could construct a shared world together if we were able to apprehend things the way that they actually are, and this would be a world where we would treat each other like brothers, and we would give each according to his ability and receive each according to his needs. That'd be a lot better, et cetera, et cetera. So how is that not occurring, right? Well, one reason it's not occurring is, again, you have these insular forms of bourgeois morality that are forming, that are initially at least very passive, right? And very resigned. People like Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard. And one thing that Lukács doesn't gesture to, but I would, is I think that part of this, of course, is that during these time periods, reactionaries really did feel like they were being beaten, right? That they were on their retreat. It was a revolutionary epoch. Things were changing. And what you usually see occur when you think your political ideology is being beaten is retreat inwards, right? To metaphysics, to God, to, Buddhism in Schopenhauer's case. And this could be a recipe for a kind of political quietism. But what's really engaging about this book is when he points out that there's a transition from this kind of passive nihilism towards a much more active kind of nihilism, with people like Nietzsche, and of course with people like the fascists, right? And this is where things get really, really tricky, because it's very obvious that Lukács has been influenced by Nietzsche, and I would still say that there's a kind of Nietzschean structure to some of his treatment of people like Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard versus Nietzsche himself and Heidegger and the later fascists, right, with their more active kinds of nihilism. But think about it from this perspective, right? In a 1922 speech, Benito Mussolini to the Fascist Congress said, look, the myth that I'm creating doesn't have to be real. All that matters is that it's edifying. All that matters is that it elevates, that it brings a sense of honor, that it brings a sense of courage, that it brings a sense of national communion, right? And it's this acknowledgement that the fascist myth is not real, but who cares? Because what does reality mean anyway? All that matters is my own subjective will impressing itself upon the world like it's a bit of clay. That's what he thinks is at the dark heart of irrationalism, and why this is going to move in such a self-destructive dimension. And this is, again, where I think it's important for us to pivot to Nietzsche, since he thinks that he's the pivotal figure in this transition from a more kind of passive insular bourgeois to a much more active, much more militantly nihilistic kind of bourgeois outlook.
Yeah, that's true. We should definitely get to Nietzsche. I totally agree. What was I going to say before that?
If Daniel's here, right, and we don't have something on Nietzsche, then the people would feel disappointed, right? It'd be like if Led Zeppelin played and you didn't hear, Stairway to Heaven. You'd be like, what the fuck is going on here?
That might be okay. Yeah. So we'd started. So we talked a few minutes ago about theses on Feuerbach. It kind of seemed like you might want to throw something in on that.
Yeah, I want to say one thing about that, if I could.
Yes, please.
Okay, so I think both of your encapsulation, your sort of summary of sort of how we should understand the theses on Feuerbach are very good. One of the things that because I'm working on a book on Lukács, so I have been reading a bit from him these days. One of the other ways to think about theses on Feuerbach is that philosopher could be interchanged with intellectual.
Right.
Because for Lukács, he is a Leninist. He thinks that Lenin's thought forms the pinnacle of his time in thought so he has this famous text called The Unity of Lenin's Thought. He thinks that Lenin is the pinnacle of political thought in particular, and strategy. He's the best strategist for the liberation of proletariat. And part of the origin of Lukács' theory of how Marx and Engels, you see, because it's really interesting. The Michael Harrington, the founder of the DSA, translated an essay by Lukács called "What is Orthodox Marxism?" And in this essay, Lukács argues that even if the kind of later Marx of the kind of higher truths of capital, value form, and so on, labor theory of value, are proven to be scientifically inadequate, Marxism still remains definable primarily through its method, through its practice. Now, we talked about the young Marx. That's obviously a young Marx or an early Marx claim. Well, one of the things we didn't mention is that, are you guys aware when the texts of the early Marx, like the German ideologies and theses on Feuerbach, actually came out? Lo and behold, they were first released in the late 1920s, early 1930s, right when Lukács is writing The Destruction of Reason. And Lukács is hired, well, he's really forced by the Soviets to go to the Marx and Engels Institute in Moscow to translate, for the first time in many ways, these early works, the German ideology. And so Lukács is in there interpreting the early Marx before anybody else. And that's why he brings this sort of praxis method-based focus to his Marxism. And that's why he thinks that in a Hegelian sense, Marxism is really about the intelligentsia, the intellectuals, imputing consciousness to the working class so that the standpoint of the working class can achieve a proper resolution to this neo-Kantian subject-object dualism, which we don't need to get into. But the basic point being that the working class actually has an epistemological advantage in capitalism because they can transcend the alienation of their commodified social being through developing class consciousness into it, right? The bourgeois position, the bourgeois class cannot do that in the same way. So they lack that revolutionary possibility, right? It's a very interesting claim. That's the claim in History and Class Consciousness in short. So, yes, all of that is animating destruction of reason in a very interesting way, just as a side point. Now, on Nietzsche, Matt is right. Nietzsche takes this is Lukács's reading, okay? Nietzsche takes an awareness into the class struggle of bourgeoisie and proletariat and understands its inside, understands its logic, understands its appearance in society, but then concocts a philosophy to disable it and to render, to what you might call nominalize it, to sort of cover it over, to steer it in a different direction from an emancipatory or egalitarian direction, right? So that is the insidious basis of Nietzsche in Lukács's eyes, which is that in some sense, he's just as political as Marx. He's not like Kierkegaard. He's not a resigned artiste. He's not some purely aesthetic philosopher on the sidelines as a hermit. No, Nietzsche is that, but he is also an engaged philosopher who calls himself a radical and is concocting a praxis that is quite militant.
Well, I mean,
then the question becomes, then the final point, then the question becomes, going back to the Hegelian point that all philosophy is an expression of a class worldview. That's Lukács's claim. That's why on Twitter recently we were debating from Chris Satur, why would Lukács call Nietzsche a bourgeois philosopher? I thought Nietzsche hated
I saw this. Yes.
Right. Well, the reason that he can call him a bourgeois philosopher is because the implicit effect of the praxis of Nietzsche is about social preservation. You see, that's another point of Lukács, right? Which is he's living in a time where capitalism could plausibly revolutionize and transform itself. He thinks that the duty of any intellectual with a conscience is to comport their philosophy towards that project. Now, of course, a liberal philosopher would come back and be like, oh, well, who are you to tell me that I must do that?
Sure.
Right? But that's why he's a bourgeois philosopher. He's not really a bourgeois philosopher because he's something worse than that. He's something more.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean,
I agree with your point.
You can sort of see the point, though, that like even if Nietzsche has all these reactionary objections to capitalism, right? These sort of that like all of this sort of hustling after money is undignified and it's I don't know, it's better to be like a ancient Greek warrior poet or something, but also to Lukács's point, he's living at a time where that's off the table, right? I mean, that's not there was nothing that could possibly happen that would somehow regress society from capitalism to some earlier mode of production, whereas there was plausibly something that would happen that would go in the other direction. And in fact, in Matt's Destruction of Reason article in Jacobin, he quotes Nietzsche asking which rabble he hates the most. So Nietzsche has takes on this, like all sorts of rabbles. You might hate different rabbles, for different reasons, but which rabble does Nietzsche hate the most?
He hates the socialist and the anarchist rabble, right? The descendants of Christianity, right? So this is a really complicated point, and I know we've talked about this before, and this is kind of why I was eager to talk about it again, because I think it's really crucial to understand. Now, I have problems with Lukács's reading of Nietzsche, right? The primary one being that I think that one of the limitations of this kind of hyper-orthodox Marxist lens is that it does tend to read the reactionary tradition in a way that's invariably stamped by the categories of Marxist thought and doesn't really ascribe any kind of independent or generative creativity to reactionary thinkers, right? Now, don't get me wrong, I'm extremely critical of reactionary thinkers, as you know, Ben, right?
Sure.
But they can be creative and they can be profound, and to Lukács's credit, he does often gesture that way, specifically with Nietzsche, right? Although I don't think he goes far enough. Because what's really interesting about Nietzsche is that from very, very early on the advantages and disadvantages of history, it's very clear that he's setting himself up as a critic of the bourgeois epic, but not a leftist critic of the bourgeois epic, because he takes aim at many of its most cherished idols, right? he philosophizes with a hammer, right? So on the advantages and disadvantages of history, he makes these distinctions between monumental history, traditional history, and critical history, right? And associates critical history with the scientific bourgeois epoch, right? And he says monumental history, to put it very briefly, is about celebrating and looking for these grand and incredible figures, your Achilles, your Napoleons, your Alexander the Greats. The problem with it is it's often not very scientific because we dissociate from all the social context that allowed for these figures to emerge, and we see them as a kind of creative genius that basically we're able to operate on their own steam. Then, traditional history looks for the roots of the individual in their community, often runs into the same kind of problems as the monumental history because it valorizes those roots. It tends to fetishize or idolize them in certain kinds of ways. So then we get to critical history, which is what he associates with the bourgeois epoch. And critical history is basically just telling history the way it is, as a series of facts, right? Yes, George Washington won the odd battle, but he was a pretty shitty general. And also, a lot of what he was doing was about money. Thomas Jefferson said some nice things about equality for all, freedom for all, etc. But he had no problem with slaves, and also, try to push them to work harder for a variety of different reasons, etc., 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 right? And the problem Nietzsche detects with critical history is that it invariably, right, undermines people's will, right, to power, their lust for life in a certain way. Because even though it describes the world the way that it actually is, when you understand the world the way that it actually is historically, you realize that you can't really do very much in it, right? We're just a collection of hydrocarbons fueled by electricity running through the motions, and we're all going to die very, very soon. And so there's a kind of implicit defense of monumental and traditional
Right for Christmas cards.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah, I will. And the uses, the advantages and disadvantages of history, and this critique of a kind of bourgeois outlook develops over the course of Nietzsche's career to the point where he really is very, very scathing of what he associates with capitalism, liberalism, democracy, modernity, because he sees it as crass, venal, life-denying, and a lot of his mature effort is an attempt to develop an entirely new way of looking at things that's explicitly, to use Daniel's term, kind of nominalist in the sense of denying that we can share Weltanschauung. But at the same time, it takes very seriously the kind of myths that these great figures are going to create that are life affirming and that can bring a certain kind of thickness to life, and that don't hold themselves to any moral scruples when trying to impose this view on the world. And Lukács rightly points out that this is extremely dangerous and can probably be traced genealogically to bourgeois roots in things like Kantianism, for example. But I would deny that it's fundamentally a bourgeois outlook because of its radical hostility to everything that is associated with that.
Although on the radical hostility point on the other end of that, right? So I just found the full quote you give. So there's his answer to whom do I hate the most heartily among the rabbles of today and the Antichrist is the rabble of socialists, skipping ahead just a little bit, who undermine the working man's instinct, his pleasure, his feeling of contentment with his petty existence, and make him envious and teach him revenge.
Oh, yeah. One of my favorite quotes from Nietzsche is where he's actually chastising German conservatives for not being tough-minded enough, where he says, and this is an extremely racist expression, right? If you want a kind of Chinaman, right, don't offer the workers any kind of education whatsoever, because then they're going to start becoming demanding and uppity. If you want a nation of slaves, which is what you should want, then don't educate the people at all. Tell them that they are slaves, and that's what you'll get. And again, it's a real testament to just how radical, in a certain way, Nietzsche's position is, that he would look at somebody like Otto von Bismarck or German imperialists and say, come on, guys, you're being way, way too soft here. We need a much more militantly reactionary kind of outlook.
Yeah.
Look, I want to say I'm in implicit agreement with most everything that Matt is saying here. I mean, it's definitely true that, first of all, the French, like say Deleuze and Foucault, let's just give them their due. They say, right, that Nietzsche's great benefit to the left is actually found in the way that Nietzsche critiques the repressive basis of bourgeois society itself. So there is therefore a whole repertoire of different aphorisms and suggestions that Nietzsche gives about, decoding repression, and even the whole idea that I develop in my book is of accelerationism, right? Has a Nietzschean kind of origin to it in some ways. Again, that's a curious point, precisely because one of the things that Lukács invents in Destruction of Reason is really great concept to understand reactionary thought, which he says that a lot of reactionaries after 1848 became what he calls romantic anti-capitalists. So instead of a implicit defense or even an apologetic position to the status quo, to the bourgeois social order, to capitalism, instead you have developed a kind of series of romantic obscuring of, it's like mercurial. You see this, for example, in a thinker like Balzac. It just so happens that in the Soviet period, the Soviets had a very guarded position regarding reactionaries. In some sense, the Soviets, I'm talking here like the early Soviets, like right at the rise of Stalin and so on, before Khrushchev, they're philosophers, right? They only discovered Engels wrote a letter to Marx where he praised Balzac. And of course, for those that don't know, Balzac was like a monarchist, right?
Right.
But he was a monarchist who hated capitalism. See, that's the difference, is that like you can be an anti-capitalist, you can be against modernity, but for the restoration of feudal absolutism and monarchy, right?
Absolutely.
That qualifies. That's curious to us today because we don't really.
Oh, Ben's best friend, Curtis Yarvin, advocates exactly those positions, right?
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
very much so.
true.
Or I kept thinking about Dugin, right? When he says in the Bernard-Henri Lévy debate that he's not a fascist because fascism is a product of modernity. Right. It's you can be, actually the man actually figured out a way to be against fascism from the right. And
well, this is why so one of the things that Nietzsche writes about in Schopenhauer as educator is that after Schopenhauer, he thinks that Schopenhauer created first Rousseau, then Goethe, then Schopenhauer, and then he leaves open a fourth to come, like the philosophers of the future, who will be philosophers of action, because he thinks that Schopenhauer, after the age of Goethe, provides the pinnacle, the paradigm of the philosophy of contemplation, which is kind of like like I said before, like the philosopher's vocation is to subtract themselves from bourgeois society. Schopenhauer gave that model. Schopenhauer, again, was a freelance philosopher, not beholden to the authority of the university, in some sense. Like if Schopenhauer was alive today, who knows how good his Patreon would be? I mean, probably not that good, but
sure.
But like if Hegel was alive, he'd probably be like, a distinguished professor, right? This is sort of the idea I'm trying to drive at.
Schopenhauer would have a lot of traction within like Doom or Twitter or something like that, though. I can see him making some inroads there, right? Being like, "Oh, you think it's bad? You would have been better off if you were never born, motherfucker."
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know about Patreon. I feel like Schopenhauer would be better suited for Substack. But yeah. So, something I want to kind of circle back to here, right? Is as you're tracing these progressions that Lukács traces in the book. Matt kind of said this in passing earlier, but we didn't really dwell on it, right? So there is this kind of, Marxist humility in Lukács' narrative, where he says, "Look, I'm not claiming that this is like, what I'm giving you here is like the big explanation of how we ended up at Hitler, right? I'm sort of giving you." What was going on at the philosopher's level of the story, but I mean, I'm certainly not claiming that this is determinative, and something that you say in your Jacobin article, Matt, is, well, this is there's something very refreshing about this humility, but the flip side of it, right? One of your criticisms of the book is that Lukács has a tendency to see sort of every argument about, philosophers, about, metaphysics and epistemology and all this stuff as sort of playing out, these underlying, economic class forces in a way that's not always plausible, right? It's this, in other words, like this kind of takes us back to, what we were talking about a few weeks ago about like, what's the sort of reasonable scope to think, that like a Marxist theory of history, can have, right? Because if you're trying to explain everything that's ever happened, well, everything that's ever happened is pretty multi-causal.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I praise this book a lot, and I want to point out I think it's magisterial and well worth reading. There are parts of it though that I did find almost kind of silly and antiquated. It's a very strange book in that way because you'll be reading along for about 80% of it and you're like, wow, this is extremely incisive. It's really well written. It's kind of funny, like I said, at various points, and very deep, right? It's very hard to be able to pull those all off simultaneously. But then they'll do something like read, Bertrand Russell's On Denoting, or the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, and be like, well, we can apply the same kind of reasoning here to talk about how they are just, bourgeois philosophers who are replicating a certain kind of liberal-ish outlook, and therefore, brush aside, their epistemological and logical claims. And the analytic philosopher in me is kind of like, well, no, let's hold on for a minute, right? First off, I don't think there's anything particularly bourgeois about Wittgenstein's decisions in life, and Bertrand Russell was a socialist, albeit a complicated one. So there's that. But beyond that, I think that we need to evaluate independently.
Went to jail for opposing World War I. So there's some, we have
to evaluate their logical and epistemological claims independently of the political context in which they might have been made. Now, could you, if you really, really wanted to be ambitious, try to explain them away by relating them back to certain kinds of material and political context? Maybe, but I'm just not very convinced by it.
Well, so I mean, I guess I do wonder. I mean, my bias here will surprise nobody is to agree with what you just said, right? But I do wonder here about ways that you could kind of make that claim seem more reasonable, right? So something Daniel talks about, I think in the Cosmonaut article, is how is about how academics will sort of often gravitate towards sets of concerns and terminology for talking about those concerns that is that's like so esoteric that it's hard to escape the impression that the esotericism is a feature, not a bug from their perspective, right? That they it's not just like, oh, this is so complicated we have to use this language to describe it, but that that it's a sign at the entrance saying plebs keep out, right? So and of course the I think that the continental version, continental philosophy version of that is sometimes more obvious, but like, I've certainly read enough exasperating analytic philosophy in my life to know that there's a version of it that lives there.
Yeah, just to kind of, to be fair and to try to defend his claim in a way that I didn't in the article.
Sure.
And to those who want to get angry at me for the article, to be clear, it was 2,000 words. I had to like abbreviate something, so I didn't dive too much into it. I think that Eric Hobsbawm is right, that there's a kind of instinct on the part of many bourgeois or liberal or Anglo philosophers to almost instinctively, or intellectuals, move towards a kind of crude empiricism, which very quickly lapses into a kind of vulgar idealism. Think about, the Richard Dawkins of the world, or the Steven Pinkers of the world, for example, right? Just this, all we need to do is look at the facts. The facts will, testify to the fact that, capital is producing a volume of goods. And yeah, there are some things that we need to tinker with around the edges, but science dictates that ultimately we are enlightened and we should just keep calm and carry on as things go forward. And from a Lukácsian perspective, A, you wouldn't be surprised by that. And B, I think that a lot of the jabs he made in the destruction of reason about the kind of thoughtlessness that's inherent in this can be explained by looking at social context and class analysis, et cetera, et cetera. I am just not of the view that you can pull the same kind of trick on Bertrand Russell's On Denoting or Ludwig Wittgenstein's, philosophical investigations, not just because I like those thinkers, but because they operate at a higher level of intellectual rigor and thought, and they need to be understood according to their own kind of merits. And obviously, you can criticize them, and many people have. Wittgenstein criticized Russell, right? But just to say, it's all bourgeois claptrap just doesn't really convince me.
So I do want to move towards wrapping up here. But Daniel, do you want to speak to any of what Matt just said?
Yeah, I mean, one of the accusations that Lukács will make on one of his fellow intellectuals, a Marxist who's also considered one of the founders of Western Marxism, Ernst Bloch, is that he thinks that Ernst Bloch practiced right-wing aesthetics and left-wing ethics, which means that, according to Bloch, irrationalist philosophies such as Schelling and Nietzsche, we need a healthy dose of them in order to sort of mobilize Marxism itself, right? It's a kind of dialectical treatment of them. And this is something that Lukács, if you read his later work, is constantly in struggle with. And this is part of the reason, like biographically, why I love Lukács, because his conscience and his ethics are of the highest magnitude, right? Like he's a thinker who became famous writing this essay called Theory of the Novel, and like literally kind of, was a sort of really wildly popular text. And then in the 1960s, he wrote an essay, which is, I no longer agree with any of it, right? And so he's constantly changing his point of view. But on this point, he really believes, for example, Lukács dies a few years after 1968. So he witnessed French Nietzscheanism. And he was interviewed. There's a great interview of Lukács, sort of, what's your opinion on centering Nietzsche as the philosopher of the left? This is from a man who witnessed the rise of Nazism firsthand, right? Spengler, who's called Nietzsche's clever ape, top Nazi jurist. Heidegger, Baumler wrote a very important book on the internal return. Of course, I'm not saying that they were the best readers of Nietzsche, but I'm saying that it was so it's very probably uncanny for Lukács to witness that historical left, right?
How could it not be, right?
How could it not be? And so he's deeply opposed to it. But one of the things that my comrade Harrison Fluss, who's a great Marxist Hegelian philosopher in his own right, he has a great book called Prometheus or Gaia, where he says, look, him and Landon Frim, two contemporary philosophers, say, look, yeah, the right is really good at creating myths, right? But so should we, right? On the left, Marxists should also think about myths, but epistemologically, philosophically, let's ground them in reason and rationality, not in irrationalism, right? So I found that interesting, which is sort of, there's kind of like limits about how you learn from irrationalism by not embracing it too intensively, right? That I think is worth looking at. Because one of the things that Lukács will say is that Marxism provides, at the level of materialism, of being, an answer to irrationalism, which most aesthetic, poetic, artistic types, which is exactly the milieu that Lukács swam in, those were his friends, refused. They refused to embrace Marxism at an ontological level. That's why the later Lukács spent all of his time writing this text called The Ontology of Social Being. What he's trying to provide is kind of a rebuttal to Heidegger, right? It's like, what is a true ontology of Marxism? And unfortunately, it's like only like a third of it is translated into English. I really am working with some people that are specialists in German. I'm not a specialist, to try to actually accelerate that translation process, because his later work is so fascinating, so good, and so systematic. But
your enthusiasm is infectious. I have to say, I hope you succeed in that project, because I would love to read probably a multi-volume work. So all the volumes of that when it comes out.
Yeah, there's a multi-volume. We just have a new release of his aesthetics. By the way, I'm co-editor of this wonderful new journal from historical materialism, which is bringing together Lukácsian scholars from around the world to publish a series of essays on destruction of reason. And one of them is an old lecture by this really famous French philosopher named Henri Lefebvre. Probably heard of this figure, who himself was very sympathetic to destruction of reason when it came out in the 1950s, because one of the things that happened in the 1950s is the Western Marxist left. This is according to John Bellamy Foster, which I really respect John Bellamy Foster, the sociologist at University of Oregon. He says, look, the reason the Western left rejected the destruction of reason is because the Korean War emerged right after World War II, basically, and it was a perfect proof of Lenin's theory of imperialism and capitalism. And Foster basically says that Lukács in the epilogue, which, Matt, you don't like the epilogue, I think it's quite interesting, he's really talking about this a lot, which is, yeah, the basis of Western intellectual life is still governed by a disavowal of imperialism, right? And this is like a kind of structural bug of capitalism, right? And it's really hard to be a sort of bourgeois intellectual and be stridently opposed to imperialism. And so that I think is an interesting aspect of this book. And Adorno had sympathies with Vietnam on the American side, right? So this idea of having a strident anti-imperialist position is not something that Lukács will budge on. Like you know what I mean? Like this again goes back to his conscience and his consistency of principles that I very much respect.
I'd like to just end with my own takes on the book.
Yeah.
And look, I suppose it's lessons for the left generally, because I know you want to move on, Ben. So is that okay?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So look, I think that there are two very important things for the contemporary left that this book accomplishes, which is, again, why I think it's a kind of a rediscovered classic, because I think the way that I've described it to people, right? The first one is that, again, it offers a truly systematic and even epic treatment of the history of reactionary thought from a Marxist perspective. And that is something that is desperately needed, not just from a Marxist perspective, but generally left critiques of the right, more broadly speaking. Now, I think that there's a lot more of this that's being done now by, Cori Robin, by people like Larry Allen Busk, who has a really good book that's coming out soon, The Right-Wing Mirror of Critical Theory, et cetera, or of course, Domenico Rosurdo with his just gigantic book, Nietzsche, the Aristocratic Rebel. But there's still a lot more work to be done. But the second thing that I think is just as important that comes through in this book is how Lukács understands, I think correctly, that the left emerged committed to, broadly speaking, an Enlightenment project that was committed to freedom for all, equality for all, solidarity for all, and predicated on this belief that ultimately human intellect can know the world, right? And what's really problematic, to Daniel's point about the French Nietzscheans, is how, in the face of many political defeats, we ironically became the kind of arch skeptics of the late 20th century and the early 21st century, right? And it was conservatives like, say, Ronald Reagan, right, who claimed to embody this kind of optimistic, rationalistic Enlightenment spirit, and who quoted people like Thomas Paine saying, we have it in our power to remake the world anew. And I think that that's an inevitable consequence of what happens to your political movement, again, in the face of political defeats. It's very easy to retreat into skepticism, into insularity, into this kind of relativistic, you make these grand universalist claims, but ultimately none of them are tenable. And I have some sympathy for these developments, right? I'm not saying don't go read Foucault, don't go read Derrida. I would never claim that. There are a lot of things to learn from them. But I ultimately think that this attitude has been a dead end for the left, right? Just unambiguously, because there's only so far you can go with hyperskepticism and cynicism and pessimism. What you really need is maybe a pessimism of the intellect, but without a doubt, an optimism of the will. And that's what really comes through in this book brilliantly, right? Is that Lukács was optimistic, right? That reason could know the world, understand reactionary thought, and that leftists could develop a superior way of apprehending reality to our reactionary rivals, right? In fact, one of the things that's most remarkable about the book is he says, what really makes Marxism special is that for the first time, the proletariat have a philosophy that is more developed, more systematic, and more profound than any of the alternatives that are available to the bourgeoisie. And I really think the left really needs to recapture some of that optimistic, constructive spirit. And that's why I think this book is so refreshing and bracing as a 21st century reading.
Fuck it. Let's do optimism of the intellect too. Yeah. No, that's great. I can't improve on that. So let's leave it right there. So I should say, beyond the Matt article in Jacobin and the Daniel article in Cosmonaut, Daniel has done tons of stuff about this. I'm sure you can find in various places. He mentioned the journal Historical Materialism, and I don't know, just Google his name and Lukács, and you'll find some stuff. But yeah, this was exactly what I hoped it would be. Thank you so much, guys.
Yeah, a lot of fun. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Good chat, and let's do it again.
Yeah, 100%.
Hope everybody reads this book. It's very readable. And
yeah, very.
And honestly, I think the other thing is you learn a hell of a lot about the history of philosophy.
Yeah,
you will encounter names you've never heard before, and so it sends you down all these different rabbit holes. It's quite nice.
Nice. All right. Sounds good. I will expect everybody to have read that by the time we reconvene next Monday. So, be prepared to answer quizzes in the chat. So, sounds good, guys. We will absolutely do this again very soon. I am going to the post game now for patrons, where Jake and Andy and I will talk about far more frivolous things. I hope that you've had good, time to think about the historical periods that you're interested in, or will pretend to be interested in.
The world is not ready for my thoughts on all of the shit you guys were just discussing. So we'll keep me to the more frivolous stuff for now. But when society's ready, I'll join the philosophy talk. So just keep me caged for now. But
fair enough. Yeah. So if you are already a patron, you should have a link in your inbox for the post game. If you are not, this would be a good time to do a little reflection on why not, and become one. And either way, I will see you there in just a minute. Left is best.